Psalm 100. Gosh, I can't hardly read verse 4 without reading the whole thing. It says this: "Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth, and worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs, and know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his people and the sheep of his pasture." And then verse 4, "Enter his gates with thanksgiving and into his courts with praise. Give thanks and praise to his name. For the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations." I'm reminded as we look here in a moment at our text, our New Testament text today on Thanksgiving, about the legend of the angels. The angels were, now I want y'all to know this is not theologically correct. It's a legend. Okay, so don't think that I'm throwing out something that's fact. It's a story. The legend of the angels who would collect the prayer requests of God's people. And as the two angels were making their way around and collecting prayer requests and things, the prayers of the saints, one angel's basket started getting heavy. And it got heavier and heavier, and it got so heavy that this particular angel could not fly anymore. So the angel was grounded. Well, his fellow angel was beside him, and his basket was relatively empty, and he thought he might help, and the angel that was so burdened said, "No, you can't help me. I have the basket that contains all of the requests for prayer, and you have in your basket just a few of the thank yous, of the answers for prayer." That's the way it usually goes, isn't it? When we want something for God, we will knock at God's door, and instead of talking and communing with God, thanking God, and all those kinds of things, we make our way for the refrigerator. And we want everything we can from God to give us. This text today says this, very familiar text. Now, on his way to Jerusalem. Have you ever wondered, to me, when I read the Bible, and maybe that's why I enjoy studying the Bible so much, is I like those little phrases that kind of put my mind to thinking about what might have been going on. When it says he was on his way to Jerusalem, I'm thinking, well, what is he on his way to Jerusalem for? Well, you and I know well what he's on his way to Jerusalem for. He's ultimately on his way to Jerusalem to die on the cross for us. But there is a passage of Scripture in the book of John that is also familiar, that tells us that one of Jesus' friends had passed away, and his name was Lazarus. And they sent out a request for Jesus to come back to Jerusalem, or really Bethany, which is right outside of Jerusalem, for Lazarus, because he was ill. Well, by the time he got there, Lazarus was dead. We see, if you put the pieces of the puzzle together in the New Testament, Jesus was headed back, and we knew he was going to die on the cross, but he had gotten the message about Lazarus, and he was headed that way. Have you ever asked your minister, ever asked Brother Randy or somebody, an elder, said, "Well, I'm sick and I really, really need you to get here to help," and they don't get there on time? Have you ever wondered what people do who are called of God between the time that you ask them to come and the time they get there. There's a lot of things that happened in Jesus' life between the time he got word that Lazarus was ill and the time he got there. And one of them was this. Jesus is pretty well minding his own business, and he travels through the border between Judea and the northern kingdom. And he gets in between this area of Samaria. Now, Samaria is an interesting place. I've heard preachers say, and it's relatively accurate to say that Samaritans were half-breed people, but I don't think that tells the story enough. Samaritans, if you look at the history of Samaritans, they were the ones that during the exile, when Israel was exiled to Babylon, they were the ones that stayed behind, and they intermarried with some local peoples there, but they kept their faith in Yahweh. And so when Israel came back from the Babylonian captivity, they found these people that were still worshiping Yahweh, but they had done what they call it, that was not what God wanted them to do, was intermingle with the local population. And they thought it wasn't so much that they had marred their genetic heritage as much as they thought they had marred their spiritual heritage. You remember in John chapter 4, Jesus meets a Samaritan woman at the well. And he offers her the water of life. And then she responds about worshiping on Mount Gerizim. Do you remember the passage? I'll read it to you because I know that sometimes we forget those. Sir, the woman said, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is Jerusalem. The Samaritans, even to this day, worship at Mount Gerizim. And the reason being is they believe when Joshua came into the promised land, that's where the mountain should have been. And that's where they initially worshiped God when they came into the promised land. And Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when neither this mountain nor Jerusalem is going to be the place you worship. So these are those Samaritans. And isn't it amazing how living along the border and having something called leprosy, a common misfortune, can break down racial and national and even religious barriers. You remember after 9/11, do you remember how our country came together through a crisis? You see, these people that were the 10 lepers had come together because all of them had a crisis. And apparently, some of them were Jews, and at least one of them was a Samaritan. And it really didn't matter about their religious squabbles because they were all outcasts because of their disease. There were 10 of them. It's an allusion to the fact that it's interesting that in order to have a synagogue, according to Jewish law, Mosaic law and Jewish law, there needed to be 10 men for a synagogue. So perhaps this little group of Samaritans had formed a little synagogue there along the border, and they were people who worshiped God and worked through their differences. They stood at a distance, which is what the law would have demanded from Leviticus chapter 13 and 14. And they called out with a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And when he saw them, Jesus told them to do exactly what Leviticus chapter 14 tells them to do. Jesus says, "You go, show yourself to the priest." And it's interesting. Now remember, all of these lepers, Jew and Samaritan alike, did exactly what Jesus asked them to do. And I would say all of them, every one of them, were grateful. But only one of them came back and gave thanks to God personally. In fact, you see that as they went, in other words, they didn't look down and see that they were healed from their leprosy and then go. All of them were obedient to what Jesus asked them to do. Go show yourself to the priest. And they did, and as they were going, apparently they looked down and their leprosy is gone. And as they went, they were cleansed. The word cleanse, this small group, and y'all are smart people, but that's the word where we get our word cathartic from. They went through a catharsis. They were physically, emotionally, they were healed. You know, when psychologists say that when we weep, we have a cleansing in our soul, a catharsis. They have a cleansing. But one of them, when he saw he was healed, y'all notice they're running, and then he sees that he's healed. Praising God in a loud voice, he threw himself at Jesus' feet and he thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Perhaps he was running with the others, and the others looked at him and said, "You probably will not be welcome at the temple because you're a Samaritan." Don't know. But he wouldn't have been. And Jesus asked, were not all 10, wasn't the whole synagogue cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except for this foreigner? Then Jesus says something that I think should resonate in all of our souls. He says, "Rise, your faith has made you," and he uses a different word here. It's not the word catharsis. It's not the word where you get a physical healing at all. It's a different word that means spiritual inner renewal and salvation. It's one thing to be healed physically. It's quite another thing, according to this, to come back to Jesus personally and have your soul well. Think about we as churches often struggle with both of these things when people are needing healing. Think of the guy who hurt his hand on the job site and he went to the clinic, and they were a very organized group of people, and they told him to go in, and he saw a little sign and said, "Well, you have illness or injury. If you go illness, you went into this door, and if you had an injury, you go in this door." He looked at his hand and said, "Well, I got an injury." Sign said, "Well, there's therapy. Do you need therapy or do you need treatment?" Well, he needed treatment. So he went to the next room, And in the next room, it said, do you need major treatment or minor treatment? Well, he's needed minor treatment, and he went in the next room, he was back out on the street. That's modern medicine. No, not really. But I'm just teasing, right? Just teasing. Just a joke. The reason things are funny is they're often true. Isn't it interesting that we often don't know what to do with people who need healing? We can be the most organized group of people in the world and have all these places where people can go, and the reality of it is they never find what they need for their soul. And that's what Jesus provides here. A few things that I think that we should be thankful for, that I'm thankful for, that I'm grateful for. First and foremost, that Jesus Christ came into my life and He transformed my soul. I confess with my mouth the Lord Jesus, and I believe in my heart God raised Him from the dead. And He said, there you shall be made well. Salvation in that. You know, I'm thankful for my mom and my dad. Now I'll tell you something. Y'all don't know a whole lot about me, but I was raised by wolves. My parents were not good people. They were alcoholics. They're abusive. We lived in shelters from time to time because of the abuse of my dad. Didn't grow up in the church. But you know, the irony of it all is that at the end of my mom and dad's life, that I was the one that God put in place to take care of them. I had the opportunity in high school. I was a relatively good English student, and I had an opportunity to take a high school elective. You can't do that much anymore, but I took an entire semester of Shakespeare in high school. Didn't go to church, but I can remember in class reading King Lear, Act 1, Set 4. How sharper than a serpent's tooth is a thankless child. That changed my life. Somehow God used that phrase from a play in high school when I wasn't even in church in order to help me understand that I should be thankful for my parents and the care they gave me. For many years, I was dependent upon them. And now, as they are dependent upon me, I am grateful to have that opportunity. We're often ungrateful for those people around us. Samuel Leibowitz, the famous New York lawyer who was a defense attorney, he famously got 78 people acquitted from having the electric chair. Not one thanked him. Not one. Every year, you need to look at the statistics of the number of children who write letters to Santa Claus. They have boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes and warehouses full of letters to Santa Claus. Yet they don't even have one box for anyone who writes a thank you to Santa Claus. We teach our children And we're often ungrateful to God. This leper was grateful. I can remember in ministry along the way, a young man in First Pastorate I served, his name was Johnny. And we lived in a parsonage at the time, and Molly and I were young. We didn't have any children at the time. And I had never been awakened in the middle of the night because of a tragedy. Didn't have cell phones or things like that, but I remember in the middle of the night, a banging on my door and on my wall of the little parsonage. And as I came out, one of our youth, we had 2 families, 4 youth. Small church, smaller than this one, by the way. And the boy, Johnny, had fallen off a horse, and he had broken his neck. And he was up here at Texoma Medical Center. The next day, what everybody wanted to do, and everybody encouraged me as a young pastor, I was 26 years old, was to have a community-wide prayer vigil for Johnny. We were a church on a Easter Sunday that had 15 people. And we had 65 people come to that prayer vigil. You know, God did a great thing. Johnny was healed. No, I can't explain it other than God. It wasn't miraculously all of a sudden healed, but all of those things, his spine began to get right again, and he was able to walk and all this kind of stuff. So I decided, well, we'll call a Thanksgiving for the whole community to thank God for what he did for Johnny. Myself, my wife, and one lady. 3 people showed up. You remember the old hymn? Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. We're going to sing that, by the way. And what we're going to do in closing today is we're going to do probably something you've done before. We're going to sing a stanza of Count Your Blessings, and then we're going to count them. Quakers used to do that as a spiritual discipline, by the way. They would count their blessings daily and one by one so they would never, ever, ever forget the things that God had done. So I want us to sing that today as my closing illustration today. And Randy knows this. Told him before, you better be ready. Huh? And he's ready. And you know all the verses, right? You're going to lead us. And after the verse, we're going to stop. And y'all better be ready. And by the 4th verse, y'all better still have some blessings. Okay? So let's sing that together.
It's 296 in the hymnal.
Let's sing it together.
296 in the hymnal.
All right.